Iran said on Tuesday that talks with world powers over reviving the 2015 nuclear deal would resume in a few weeks. This after Iran agreed to renew UN nuclear inspections. Meanwhile, on the Korean Peninsula, envoys from Japan, the United States, and South Korea are keen on denuclearization efforts following the DPRK's recent string of missile tests. Recently, at the last stop of Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang's Asia tour, he and South Korean President Jae-in did agree to double down on denuclearization efforts. So, what's the prospect of curbing nuclear arms race? Let's bring in our panelists. For the latest on IAEA meetings and global denuclearization in Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, professor of history at American University. Also, Toby Daunton, co-director and senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program with Carnegie Endowment. In Beijing, Zhao Tong, senior fellow, Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. The IAEA meetings are still underway, but there are a lot on the agenda. First of all, how do you see the latest apparent achievement between IAEA and Iran about a further look into the country's nuclear program? Mr. Dalton.
I think it's really important that Iran continues to cooperate with the IAEA to allow access to monitor its nuclear facilities. Obviously, there's lots of problems with the Iran nuclear deal signed with 6 other negotiating powers, and the IAEA is the key implementing agency for inspections in Iran. So I think this is an important temporary measure, but it doesn't fundamentally address the concerns, the problems that are hampering a resumption of the deal.
Professor Kuznick.
Well, I certainly agree with Toby about that. This is a serious problem internationally. We had a chance to negotiate with a much friendlier regime, but the new regime in power now is more of a hard line, and they're going to be a little bit more difficult to negotiate with. Unfortunately, the United States abrogated the JCPOA back in 2018, which puts the United States in the position of needing to deliver. And the United States, in my opinion, has got to take the initiative and even make some compromises where it might not want to. But Biden is going to be under pressure from the Republicans, as well as from some hawks within the Democratic Party, to not give many concessions to the Iranians, and that's going to make negotiating difficult.
Mr. Dalton, of course, we haven't seen much actions on international policy besides the Biden administration's policy toward China or about China. Do you expect more real policies and actions from this administration on Iran?
Well, just to highlight one thing that is often overlooked, which is that in the very first days of this administration, they very quickly put in place an extension of the New START arms control treaty with Russia. That's long been forgotten because it happened, eons ago in Washington time, and yet that was a really key measure that allowed for the continuation of cooperation there. But apart from Iran, I think the constraints faced by the Biden administration here in Washington are manifest and really hamper its ability to focus on many foreign policy issues, let alone key nuclear policy issues beyond Iran, such as North Korea or others.
Mr. Zhao, tell me more about your assessment on the Iran IAEA issue.
As Mr. Dalton just said, the plate was very full for Mr. Biden, so it took some time before some really effective communications and meetings took place between US and Iran. So we didn't have a deal before the previous Iranian administration went out of power. And then there is this silent period in the summer, but with a new and more conservative and hawkish administration in power today, it will also take more time before even starting substantive engagement. I think
see.
that delay is really making some Chinese experts nervous, and they worry that the prospect of a swift and effective resumption of JCPOA is becoming doomer today.
How do you see that with the latest agreement of IAEA and Iran without JCPOA? How do you see the prospect, Mr. Zhao?
I think as Mr. Dalton also implied, it was a technical and temporary solution, trying to keep the monitoring at key Iranian sites working. But we still need much greater political commitment from our sides in order to have this JCPOA negotiation restarted as soon as possible.
Do you see China's commitment?
Well, I think China is very committed. China's position has long been that the U.S. withdrew from the deal unilaterally. So it's better that if Washington can take a more flexible approach and to demonstrate its willingness. And then it also requires the new Iranian administration to be very cooperative. I think we heard in recent days that Russia putting a little more pressure on Iran, hoping it to stick to its positions prior to the suspension of talks in late spring. I think China also can contribute a little more by also nudging the Iranian government slightly to the direction so that we can move things forward.
What about the other hotspot issues, DPRK, denuclearization? In fact, we don't call it DPRK denuclearization, but rather the Korean Peninsula denuclearization, because it does not is something only takes DPRK's effort. So go to you, Mr. Dalton, about that. Recently, some interesting movement.
Well, I think there's not been a lot of movement. In fact, if anything, the indications from the Korean Peninsula are in the other direction, with missile testing by both North Korea and South Korea in recent weeks. And the display of new capabilities suggests, in fact, that there's an arms race that is on, which makes the denuclearization prospects even harder to achieve. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, I think they've put out a statement that says that their policy is for a practical and calibrated approach to this issue. Yet we do not see a lot of impetus behind it, apart from offers that the U.S. is willing to talk anytime, anywhere without precondition. That's not what North Korea is looking for. Frankly, I think that's not what is needed at this moment to actually open a new window for diplomacy.
Very interesting. The North and South Korea developments almost all at the same time, while the geopolitics are changing in the region, Mr. Zhao.
Yes, indeed. We are seeing a new wave of inter-Korean arms race with both countries testing all sorts of missile systems, including very capable ones like submarine-launched ballistic missiles and even train-based ballistic missiles from North Korea. And there is, we need to put a handle onto this and contain this very dangerous trend from further escalating. I think that requires all the major powers in the region being on the same page. I think China, US, South Korea can certainly have a new round of discussions. And that is also useful for achieving the eventual role of a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, because we need to build a new peace regime.
Okay.
So how to construct a new regional security structure is part of that big picture question.
Professor Kosnik, unfortunately, I have to put that question forward to you once again, that is the United States have the willingness, the determination, and the capability and the time to deal with the DPRK nuclear issue as well?
Well, it might not have the time and the focus. You have to remember that first Biden was consumed with the withdrawal from Afghanistan in recent weeks. And there are a lot of things going on in the United States politically. The COVID problem, the killing of the civilians by mistake in Afghanistan. There's a lot of political issues on Biden's plate right now. But North Korea is an important problem. And the North Koreans seem to be expanding right now. They're in a somewhat aggressive mode again. They seem to be increasing the amount of fissile material. They seem to be possibly expanding the number of centrifuges. They already have a big stockpile. And if that is growing, then that is a serious concern. The more the United States delays on both Iran and North Korea, the more difficult both of those issues become. So I think we need to see some quick action on the part of the United States, but the United States is limited to what it can do with North Korea. If North Korea refuses to talk to the United States again is going to need to turn to Russia and China to try to convince the North Koreans to come back to the negotiating table.
Okay. How do you see that, Mr. Dalton, the urgency and now the interesting geopolitics that might be hindering the earlier kinds of cooperation?
Well, I think it's a really key point that Jiatong raised about the need for cooperation to look beyond just specifically the denuclearization issue to the broader peace regime that's required on the Korean Peninsula. I think we could all agree that avoiding a war on the Korean Peninsula is something that we should all work for. And yet, when it comes to a vision for what the future of the Korean Peninsula should look like, I think that we see divergent interests. And so that makes diplomacy to even get into a new negotiation with North Korea that much harder. Yet, as Professor Kuznick said, the urgency is becoming more clear, one warhead at a time, frankly.
Mr. Dalton, the point of our discussion is not to criticize the United States. One of the things people ask is whether the U.S. is willing to work with South Korea to end a war and officially announce that. That's what the peace regime, a key point of it. Now, how much willingness, determination, capability, time, and political will is there to do that?
I think, honestly, there's not a lot of political will. And indeed, I'm quite concerned that given the geopolitics, the opportunities to even exercise what will there is are narrowing. And that's not just because of US-China considerations, but also what's happening between the two Koreas with the arms race that we see. South Korea faces an election to elect a new president in a little over 6 months. Who knows how that will turn out? Obviously, the administration of President Moon had made a significant effort in 2017-18 to initiate the new peace process that didn't pan out. And so I think that it's going to take a little while again before there's a new opportunity to work on the peace regime. That's not the fault of the United States. It's not the fault of South Korea or other states. I think it's just the international circumstances as
the
North Korea has been
circumstances earlier with the Trump administration is to not necessarily do much and fail to reach any result during the two peace so-called negotiations, both in Singapore and in Vietnam. I'm afraid it's not just a situation that nobody should take responsible for. There is parties of responsibility. Well,
look, I think that there's blame to be shared for that. I think that the Trump administration tried to do certain things, but it was also not able to follow it through because of internal disagreements about what should be done. I think it's also clear that North Korea was not willing to go as far as they purported to go in terms of offering steps for denuclearization. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a missed opportunity and an unfortunate one. And that now the situation is such that, again, not through the fault of specific parties, but because of international circumstances, the diplomacy is just going to be that much harder.
I see. Professor Kuznick.
We have to look compared to the situation we confronted back in 2017, when the head of the Council on Foreign Relations said he thought there was a 50-50 chance that we were going to go to war with North Korea. The situation we're in now is certainly better. We lost ground under Trump when he and Kim were writing love letters. It could have been doing something a little bit more serious at that point, but we have very, very different visions. The North Koreans are not about to give up their nuclear weapons. I think the United States has to recognize that. We need to, I hope we can freeze those nuclear weapons and we can use that as a basis for building a little bit of trust. We haven't even ended the Korean War yet. And how many years has that been? So there's a lot of things that we need to do to build up trust between the United States, South Korea, and North Korea. And again, I think that if we can improve relations between the United States and China, then that can go a long way toward helping create an environment which that becomes possible.
Mr. Zhao, is that the key?
I don't think it matters. For China to invest its fiscal capital into resolving North Korean issue requires a better U.S.-China relationship and the China-South Korea relationship. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang just visited South Korea. I think one of the important concerns of China is whether South Korea is going to forge a closer security alliance relationship with the United States or even to join the US-led Quad Plus security regime, which is viewed by Beijing as being anti-China. If South Korea and the US can show greater interest in stabilizing their relations with China, I think that will certainly help China be more willing to contain North Korea's nuclear provocations, missile provocations. One, I think, important future opportunity is for Beijing to use the Winter Olympics to host, important officials from these countries, so they would have an opportunity to jumpstart the diplomatic process. I think that to make that successful would require support from US, South Korea, and other countries.
Of course, this is also the decision of the IOC, one of the very key figures if we talk about the Winter Olympic Games, Mr. Zhao. I'm sure you're aware of that. Having said that, though, let me also ask all of you. Chinese President Xi Jinping, during his speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations, he talked about three key areas: security, development, and also human rights. He also asked statesmen and leaders around the world to be able to answer those so-called centennial key questions. How do you see today we should learn from the earlier mistakes?
When I think of statesmanship in that regard, I think of the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Kennedy and Khrushchev, they worked together to try to do, as Khrushchev said in a letter to Kennedy, said, let's eliminate every conflict between us that could lead to a new crisis. We need that kind of leadership, that kind of vision. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated and Khrushchev was toppled, but they had that vision. And there have been very few times when the world's leaders have had that kind of vision. What we see is the United States viewing China increasingly not just as a competitor, but as an adversary, almost an enemy, and building up alliances. This deal with Australia and Britain, I think, is exactly the wrong kind of thing. And that not only in terms of the alliances with Europe, but also in terms of the potential for nuclear proliferation. We're talking about nuclear submarines that very likely will use nuclear fuel that's going to be enriched to 94%.
Right.
The potential for proliferation in that regard, and the precedents that sets. What if Pakistan or Iran wants China to help them develop nuclear subs? Now there's a loophole that they can all drive through. So I think we're not approaching it in the way we need to. I think the Biden administration needs to take a step back, and we need to find the common grounds between us and China that we can work on together to build an environment of much more trust than exists right now.
I see.
Well, specifically on leadership and echoing what Professor Kuznick said, finding opportunities like Reagan and Gorbachev did, where they could align their visions and take risks, both of them political risks with their domestic audiences to advance and push their governments into these arrangements that ultimately ended the Cold War. I think the same kind of risk-taking with domestic politics is necessary not only in the United States, but in China and Russia and other countries too. The challenge that we face is that all of our countries are going through nationalist moments right now. where that kind of risk-taking, the demonstration of leadership, the willingness to extend a hand of cooperation to other countries is criticized domestically as being weak or playing into the hands of enemies or things like that. So it's a very difficult moment, but it is an absolutely necessary thing that has to happen. On the submarine agreement, I agree. The precedent, I think, is really unhelpful and unfortunate from a non-proliferation standpoint. And yet, I think that you see a lot of support for that agreement in countries in East Asia, in Korea, in Japan, in India. So it's a very complex system, I think, that we're seeing evolve there. But I agree that the precedent of supplying nuclear reactor technology for naval propulsion is an unfortunate one, and could be something that Iran, for instance, uses as a pretext for enhancing its enrichment of uranium that could ultimately be used for nuclear weapons.
I think the greatest concern is it shows the major powers, US, UK, Australia, they are willing to prioritize great power competition over global non-proliferation principles. And that shows that we do need top-level political commitment to manage these trends. Recently, we see US and Russian presidents jointly repeating the Reagan-Gorbachev statements of nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. I think the proposal to have a P5 heads of states summit would make sense because it would create opportunity for all the top leaderships from these great powers to sit together and sort through all these important high politics issues.
All right, Zhao Tong, Toby Dalton, and Peter Kuznick. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.